Hello again, Dan Alasso here. Each week during the semester, and often during a lot of my breaks as well, I spend a fair amount of my time building stories to tell to students. Narratives that connect a series of events or ideas that I want to impart in a course unit. And as I do that, I'm typically trying to guide the story along a particular path that combines really the basic stuff that students are supposed to learn in history classes and some additional items that I think maybe correct or add to the students' understanding of the past. I think it's always useful for a historian to double check and also to cite their sources, especially because no one can know everything. Recently, I was critical of Alan Guelzo's mistakes when he claimed in his Great Courses lecture, the last one that I reviewed, that both Ferdinand and Isabella and their daughter Joanna had both been the parents of just a single child. And this is wildly inaccurate, as well as really being kind of a pointless detour off his main narrative. At first, I thought this had been only because he was kind of outside of his own specialization, which is Civil War history. But I later noticed that Guelzo had lifted whole passages from Alan Taylor's American Colonies, which, when you think about it, is much closer to his field than Spanish dynastic details. And that sort of undermined the whole thing for me. Although I think I will continue listening and reviewing the lectures. The lesson, I think, is not only to try to be humble, but also to trust but verify when you're compiling and synthesizing secondary material into a tertiary textbook or lecture kind of a document. But as I'm doing that, I'm also very aware of the artificiality of narrative and of all the things that I'm leaving out when I'm connecting the particular dots that I've chosen out of the infinite number of dots available. It's a bit like drawing constellations in the sky. What about the stars that you've ignored? Why does this particular one link to the next one in the pattern? Why did you choose that pattern? In history, we sometimes convince ourselves that there's an inevitable logical order of causes leading to effects. But which causes and which effects? And even when we can agree that there are certain big events that ought to be featured in a story, there are almost always a lot of interesting details that we pass over, that we have to pass over, just in order to get from point A to point B. An alternative to this, which I've been pondering really for a while, is to try to deconstruct the narrative a bit. Not to abandon the historian's job of interpreting the past and deciding what's most important and relevant, and presenting our findings and our interpretations in an understandable and a hopefully interesting way, but perhaps to give the reader or the student a bit more agency in deciding which elements of a slightly wider angle description of the past is really the most interesting to them. Since I was working in the computer industry when the World Wide Web became a thing, and since I remember very fondly early hypertext document systems like Bill Atkinson's HyperCard, which was released by Apple in 1987, I've always kind of had a soft spot for branching, kind of choose your own story types of structures. I bought Eastgate's Storyscape about 10 plus years ago, but the hypertext novel never really took off. Partly, I suspect, this was due to the extreme or even exponential additional work that would be involved in building not just a single story that proceeds in a line or a curve from point A to point B, but instead some kind of a web that a reader could travel in, experiencing different stories, perhaps, or maybe the same story from different perspectives. That would be very complicated and difficult and time-consuming. History, on the other hand, seems like it might lend itself a bit to this type of approach. There are events and people and places that we can locate in a sort of matrix. Maybe these are the things that in Doctor Who are called fixed points in time. But then we can explore how they relate to each other, especially since historians have become much more interested in recent years in points of view other than just the great men on whom we used to focus. So this opportunity to connect ideas together in a wider variety of ways might be valuable at this point. It might also be satisfying for readers or students to pursue the links that interest them, rather than being constantly led by the nose to the next point that the author thinks is the most important. Again, authors are still not really off the hook. They still have to choose a finite number of links and make the connections available and sensible to the user and relevant to the theme. There's also an ongoing kind of question about the length of a card or the length of a thought, which has been kind of a persistent feature of discussion in note-making circles and debates about how some writers prefer a long-form kind of rambling stream of consciousness, while others thrive with outlines and atomic notes. I tend to be one of those people who often will just begin a daily note essay, like this one, and then just keep typing for a while to see where it goes. Sometimes, as I did in this post, I'll have a new thought as I'm working out something, and I'll start a new paragraph with a phrase or a sentence below the one that I'm working on, with the new thought that I can expand in its turn. And this is helpful because if I ignore that little brainstorm when it comes to me, it's often gone for good. Or at least it sinks back into the depths until a particular new combination of thoughts trigger it, but often much later and not in time for it to be useful to me. This is a long story, but the upshot of it is that I think the history that I want to write, that I'm going to try to contribute to the world as my unique contribution to online education, will probably be this type of thing. I've been writing these kind of longish 45-minute to an hour-long lectures each week for my students in a variety of classes, and I'll continue doing that. But I'm also going to begin exploring how the ideas that I'm presenting to my students can also maybe be presented in a web format that will allow students not only to kind of follow a narrative arc that I determine, but also to link to ideas related to what I'm describing. So a reader who was interested in the Atlantic slave trade, or the development of corporations, or ideas that led to democratic institutions in U.S. history, for example, could jump from point to point following those ideas rather than waiting patiently for the next time that I'm going to mention it in my narrative. In a sense, this is a digital index. And interestingly, I think that nearly everything that we do digitally has an analog in the analog world. But in this case, it's right there on each page, inviting the reader to explore. And I've thought about this for a while, and I've thought for a while that Obsidian Publish might be a tool that I could use to achieve this type of webbed history. I've made some stabs with that already, with some success, and I'll continue working on that, hopefully in real time as I continue making content for my courses this semester and this summer. I'm hoping that I'll be working again in the Minnesota State system this fall, but I also hope that I'll be able to turn some of this material that I'm creating into freestanding learning content that I can offer directly to lifelong learners. So stay tuned, and I'll let you know how that's going. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.